I'd like to have a very warm welcome to my guest today, Sandro Boeri, who is president of the Institute for Internal Auditors. Very warm welcome,
Thank
Sandro.
you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Susan. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Great to see you here. You've had an amazing career, really illustrious career, and we're going to touch on culture, and we're going to talk about toxic workplace cultures. And I think what will be interesting is from a risk and audit perspective, but why don't you tell the audience about your professional journey so far?
I guess it started off at the age of 18 when I didn't know what I wanted to do when I left school. I certainly didn't want to go to university. So I applied for a job and ended up with a job in a bank in the internal audit department. I didn't know what internal audit was, but they promised me that I would journey all over the world. So I managed to get to 42 countries in 6 years and managed to see the inside of a bank from top to bottom. Then my career started to progress as an internal auditor, worked for a whole variety of cultures, the French, the Brits, the Americans, the Japanese, the Dutch. Then I had my first midlife crisis, decided I never wanted to work for anybody again. So I set up my own business called Risk Audit, which was a recruitment and training business for internal auditors in financial services. That business survived the global financial crisis, which gave me a great opportunity to reflect on the human condition. How can bankers blow up the economy? I'm sure we might talk about that in a moment.
We might do, yes.
Then I had my second midlife crisis and I joined Deutsche Bank. I spent 7 years there responsible for assessing the culture of the bank and developing their auditors. And now Risk Audit is back again. I got made redundant in January. So I'm president of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, so sort of cheerleaders for internal auditors. And I'm working on Risk Audit, which is a business that's primarily focused on persuading people to think about culture from a behavioural risk perspective, looking at culture through the lens of controls and how you can best influence human beings.
That's fascinating. I'd like to come back to that if I may. What I'd like to know more about is, let's sort of begin with your experience of workplace culture, because you don't normally think about risk and audit and workplace culture in the same sentence. So was there for you like an aha moment where you thought, oh, this makes sense, the impact I can have? So what was it about workplace culture for you?
I would say that there were two segments in my career, the logical segment and the emotional segment. So the logical segment was, I'm an internal auditor. I'm looking at the way a control process is structured. I'm coming up with recommendations for improving that control process. And I'm assuming that human beings will always do the common sense, logical thing. Then we had the global financial crisis, which saw NatWest go bust, Northern Rock, and so on. And it was quite clear that a bunch of human beings working in a bank didn't do the logical thing. They blew up banks. They missold. They stole from people. And that was the transition into what I call the emotional phase of my career, which is trying to understand, why do human beings do what they do? So very much two halves. So now what I'm trying to do is build a bridge between those two halves, because I believe you can influence human beings using control processes. So the real turning point was the horror of the global financial crisis, because if we look at what happened in this country, it led to a period of austerity. I would argue austerity led to Brexit without reopening the Brexit debate. And I would argue Brexit's probably going to lead to a few other not inconsequential outcomes. Caused by what? Caused by a complete blow up in a sector that I've spent most of my career.
So let's talk about this blow up then, because, how far was that due, do you think, to the workplace culture, or was it just due, as many people think about toxic workplaces, as being down to a few bad apples? There were just a few bad apples at the top, some people would argue. Do you think it's a few bad apples, or is it more than that?
No, I think it's the barrel, as people say. It's not the bad apple. I'm a great believer that people come to work, on the whole, wanting to do a good job. Then something happens. So if we look at the banking industry, what happened? Somehow a bunch of human beings decided that it was okay to take excessive risks and not think about the downside. A bunch of human beings thought it was okay to missell instruments that they were essentially lying as to what these instruments were worth. A bunch of regulators decided to turn a blind eye, looking at life from an optimistic perspective and not looking at the downside. These are all outcomes related to the workplace culture that was in the banking industry. So a culture that encouraged people to not really care too much about the consequences of their actions. And that's before we talk about the way human beings treated each other in the workplace. Because I've seen some, and I've experienced some eye-opening, quite distressing behaviour in the banking industry that type of culture encourages.
There was a lot around that time of this sense of, particularly for RBS or NatWest as it's now called, of too big to fail. That it was too big, nothing could possibly go wrong. That proved to be completely wrong. But there was this sense of that you could do whatever you wanted. And that's exactly what you've just been saying, really. The behaviours that you saw that went on.
It created a safety net that gave people permission to do whatever they felt they should indulge in. And I'm not convinced that behaviour has completely disappeared. I think the banking industry is very much in a different place to where it was, say, 10 years ago. But I am seeing a degree of complacency now in the banking industry. And whilst that behaviour might manifest itself, it won't be identical, but it won't be a good news unless we can get our head around this concept of behavioural risk, which I think is so important.
Okay, well let's talk about behavioural risk then. What is it about behavioural risk, and what have you seen? Because you talked about some bad examples, but what do you see?
Let's talk about examples.
Yes.
First of all, can I give you an example that came to light last week? In Japan, the chief executive officer of Nomura bursts into tears, apologises, and says he's taking a pay cut. Why? Because one of his salespeople, his relationship managers, attempted to murder an elderly couple in Hiroshima while selling them some products. Now, is that unusual? It's the first time I've heard about attempted murder. But have I physically seen people harass customers? Yes. Have I physically seen people harass employees? Absolutely. Have I seen bullying and harassment, psychological harassment? Absolutely. I've seen people being demeaned. I've been demeaned. Let's just say that for 6 years, I worked under a hostile, manipulative, controlling environment. And when you're a teenager or you're young and you don't know anything about anything, you think it's normal. Now I realise it's totally abnormal. Do I believe that these individual human beings set out to cause distress? No. But something happened in the culture that led to these human beings thinking it was okay to behave in that fashion. So for me, behavioural risk is the risk that people behave in an inappropriate fashion. And the fun is then defining, well, what do we mean by inappropriate fashion?
Yes, and I think, well, let's come to that, because there is this piece around, well, how would one define what is inappropriate? We've just seen recently in the news, was it just banter, or was there something more demeaning about the whole process? And there's a kind of, sometimes people say a fine line, but maybe it isn't so fine. Maybe there is a bit more difference between those sort of like two areas. So if we think about those examples that you've seen, what do you think led people to believe they could get away with this type of behaviour? Was it the culture that enabled that behaviour to come through? Was there an expectation they should behave in that way? Or was it the individuals, the other way around, the individuals that were allowed to behave in that certain way?
I think,
which comes first, I guess, is around...
I would say it's the absence of a framework within which grey zones can be reflected on and talked about. Society's expectations of behaviour change. So I was brought up in an environment where male dominated female, where people who shouted the loudest won. And because I didn't know any better, I thought that was the way of being in business. A real culture shock for me was when I joined Deutsche Bank. So I've been running my own business for 17 years. And all of a sudden I joined Deutsche, and during the first 3 months I was subjected to training module after training module on diversity and inclusion. I think within 1 week of joining, I was invited to a coming out party.
Right.
And let me be honest, at that point in time, I was thinking, what's this got to do with the workplace? Isn't it about a meritocracy? You come to work, you treat people with kindness, you treat people the way you'd like to be treated, and it'll be okay. Now I think very differently. One of the things I learned at Deutsche Bank was that you need to help people work out what society's expectations are, how society's expectations are changing, and how you navigate through the dilemmas that that actually causes. So the Black Lives Matter movement was born when I was at Deutsche Bank. And the concept of the microaggression was something that was discussed. Now, I was a microaggressor. I didn't even have a clue that I was a microaggressor. I was a diminisher of people. I didn't even know I was a diminisher. I was accidentally diminishing.
Do you want to say a little bit more about
Yeah.
that? Do people point that behaviour out to you at Deutsche Bank? Or?
No. People would feel uncomfortable, but they wouldn't say it to my face. They might say it behind my face. But I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have anyone to talk to. So when it comes to these behavioural management frameworks, we're talking about creating an environment where, very simply, where you feel uncomfortable, there is someone you can go and talk to. The expectation is you go and talk to them. And you express feelings. This is the way this makes me feel. How does this make you feel? And that's the norm, as opposed to burying stuff under the carpet. I would say I've been working for 45 years now. 30 of those years have been in an environment where stuff constantly gets swept under the carpet. And as a result, there's no opportunity to reflect on the difference between right and wrong. And what makes this challenging is society's expectations are constantly evolving. So it's almost as if you're trying to articulate how people should behave in an environment where you've got quicksand, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more then about the behavioural management framework.
Yeah.
How would I, CEO of a large organisation that might be facing some reputational damage through some rogue individuals who've gone off and, been on the media and said certain things a bit inappropriate. Well, how would that sort of help me in the organisation? How would you put this into place as a behavioural management framework?
There's 4 simple principles, but they all come with a degree of complexity. So, principle number 1 is being able to articulate what is the purpose of the organisation. So I'm presuming, Susan, there is a purpose that gets you out of bed every day. Yeah? In addition to making money. If an organisation can articulate that purpose and then can express that purpose in a language that its different groups of employees can understand, you've got an hallelujah moment. Where people think that coming to work is only about people enriching themselves, then that is disheartening. People get disengaged, and that starts to create the toxic environment. So that's principle number 1.
Okay, so purpose is
purpose, I think, is incredibly
big driver.
And as we get into the Gen Z, the Gen X, and so on, it becomes even more important. Although I would argue, now that I reflect, I've always been quite a purpose-driven individual at work. Secondly is expressing to people, once again, in a language they can understand, what is expected of people in relation to behaviour. So, for example, if I'm a salesperson, how am I expected to behave? If I'm in an operations or call centre, how am I expected to behave? But expressing that aspirational culture in a language which engages the employee, in a language which doesn't only speak to the employee's brain, but speaks to the employee's heart. So number 2 is expressing the aspirational culture. Number 3 is measuring it. Now, measuring it is a very expensive thing to do. I've had lots of interaction with the HR profession. And on a bad day, when I talk about measuring culture, somebody says, we'll do an engagement survey. An engagement survey is like taking a selfie. That doesn't tell you anything about the culture and what's going on underneath. at the end of the day.
We can have a debate in a moment about that. Okay.
I'd love to have that debate.
We'll have a debate about that. Okay.
So number 3 is measuring culture so that you can compare the behaviours you're actually witnessing to the behaviours you would like to witness. And number 4 is having a game plan, constant game plan for transforming the culture where you need to transform the culture. So that framework consists of those 4 segments.
Yeah, so we've got purpose, expectations, measuring, and a game plan. This game plan, though, is that just really like an action plan? Is it kind of big interventions? Is it big stuff or little stuff? What kind of things?
It depends on what you're trying to
Okay.
change, but it typically consists of tone, communication, tone at the top, tone in the middle, tone from the culture carriers. I get frustrated when people say it's all about tone at the top. Well, if you're running an 80,000 person company, it's tone at the top is relatively meaningless. It's more about tone in the middle, and it's very much about tone expressed by the people who actually carry the culture, which can sometimes be some of the most junior employees in the business.
I agree.
It's about storytelling. So that tone is not only about a nice glitzy presentation, it's about the way people connect using stories. Once again, the way people appeal to the heart. It's about incentivization and disincentivization. If you're trying to change behavior, you're probably dealing with the mentality of a teenager. So for those of you with kids out there, can I take you back to the carrot and stick that you applied to try and instill values in people? It's about making sure that all forms of engagement are talking the language of the people you're trying to engage with.
Okay, very good. So let's come back to this idea of measuring, because I said we should have a little debate about that. And I'm with you actually around that when,
Really?
yes, because engagement surveys tend to kind of ask all the the ones I've seen, and I've been in HR for 35 years or plus. And a lot of the engagement surveys have all asked the kind of very nice questions. Are you proud to work here? Would you recommend this as a great place to work? To your friends, neighbours, etc. Those are kind of positive, really nice, positively framed questions. What organisations miss, and this is the work that we do at Zura, is around asking those questions that could be more challenging. In other words, are unacceptable behaviours tolerated in the organisation? If you're really serious about culture, you have to measure the positive, but you also have to measure the dark side of culture as well, the negative.
I agree.
And that, to me, is the piece that we've missed. From an HR profession, we've missed that. And we absolutely have a duty of care and to represent sort of a bit of organisational justice.
Yeah.
So that's where I go when I say let's have a debate about that, because how come we've missed this? It's nice to go back to your CEO and say, hey, look how wonderful we are. But unless we know where, as a heat map, where there might be pockets of toxic subcultures emerging, those are the areas that we need to go back and have a look at. And organisations, I think, miss that at their peril.
I think the reason I get frustrated with engagement surveys is they don't tell you what's really going on. They don't tell you the why. They take time, not so much the time to craft the survey and to get the answers, but the vast amount of management time that goes into interpreting the answers. I mean, it's almost like a mind-reading exercise. So why do we think X% think that the culture is lousy in this particular place? It's very rare that a survey can give you the answer to that question. So for me, when I talk about measurement, I talk about getting a little bit deeper. So I talk about qualitative measurement. In other words, sitting down, interviewing people in a way where you can create some transactional psychological safety, where I can try and get an idea of why you feel the way you feel, but I do it in a way that's scientific. I do it in a way where I'm collecting data from a sample of people that's allowing me to try and understand what's driving your perceptions. Because if I know what's driving your perceptions, then I can come up with a transformational plan to deal with those drivers. That's a much more productive use of very expensive resources, in my opinion.
That is really interesting. So how do you persuade people or organisations to take up the behavioural management framework?
Can I give you the ideal answer?
Yes.
The ideal answer is you inspire people to believe that such a framework is good for business, It's good for employee engagement. It's good for a happy workplace. Eliminates a toxic workplace culture. And hallelujah, the world is a beautiful place. But can I give you the real answer, what I really feel? It normally needs some form of setback to create action. Something has to go wrong. So if you wouldn't mind me speaking about sort of banking example, something I've got involved in now is called the Culture Summit.
Okay.
It's a movement rather than a summit, but it consists of a group of behavioural scientists. It consists of risk managers and auditors, but it also consists of C-suite executives. And the idea is to persuade the UK's financial services regulators to hold banks and financial services companies to account.
Yeah.
In other words, say to them, do you have this behavioural management framework? Not to tell them how to do it, not to go into great detail, but to introduce an implied threat, which is negative stimulus, to say, if you don't do this, there will be repercussions.
Yeah.
The hope is that that creates a bit of momentum for organisations to start to reflect on, how do I get purpose? How do I inspire an aspirational culture? How do I measure? How do I transform? So I hate to say it, my reflections are that negative stimulus probably has to come first, but the hope is that people will start to see the benefits of these frameworks. I mean, there are examples of companies that I've come across. I won't give you the names, but you'll probably know who I'm talking about. Healthcare companies that insure. So insurance companies that basically make the world a better place by helping people medically recover, get the medical treatment they need, essentially transform lives and use the inspiration of the lives they're transforming to inspire their staff and their employees to do even better.
Yeah. So let's talk about that negative stimulus, because, you mentioned 2008.
Yeah.
That was a huge negative stimulus. It was a failure of culture. I'm not saying that. That was what was said by the Financial Conduct Authority. It was a complete failure of corporate culture that led to the global financial crisis. Massive. Since then, the FCA have put in some form of survey they run. They do ask a number of sort of, I'd say questions that look at issues, but you're still finding people, quite a significant number of people, a high percentage that feel under significant pressure to perform.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed that much in that measurements. I mean, we're not seeing much of the dial moving in that. It's been recorded, but exactly to your example that you gave about in Japan, there's this pressure that is constantly there and doesn't seem to be, so not abating, but it seems to be increasing.
It's not only in Japan, you've had graduates joining investment banks, dropping down dead within relatively quick periods of time.
Yeah.
So basically people working 20 hours a day. I have a hypothesis, and I'm not convinced the regulators agree with me on this at the moment, but this is my hypothesis. A lot of good work has been done in changing behaviour, but that work has been done in a way that doesn't embrace behavioural science. If I can give you an example, we have something called an individual accountability regime in financial services, where individuals are accountable, theoretically could even go to prison if they don't behave properly in relation to different responsibilities. Two people in a bank are accountable for culture: the chairman of a bank and the chief executive officer of a bank. But what does that mean? What are the reasonable steps that are expected from those two individuals in terms of fostering an appropriate culture in the business? And the answer is, I don't know. Behavioural science hasn't really been embraced by the regulatory community or by the financial services sector in general in terms of working out, how do you instill an appropriate culture in a workplace? Now, I don't believe behavioural science is rocket science. I actually do believe that there are some fundamentally quite simple steps that one can take. But we don't talk about these steps. What we do is we tell people what to do and we expect them to do it. I was in Nicosia about a month ago, and
it's a great city, by the way.
Beautiful city.
We were there. I was there in May, actually.
Really?
Yes, beautiful.
The weather wasn't as nicer than here. This lovely gentleman, he was a Cypriot regulator, basically gave a presentation on the anti-money laundering package, the latest iteration of European Union money laundering packages. And we got into quite an interesting discussion after, where I said to him, what makes you think that these regulations will have more success than the previous 6 or 7 iterations that came before? He said, oh, these are improved regulation. There was no behavioural science that came into play at all in crafting these regulations and the interventions. I think it's about time the financial services sector embraced behavioural science, is really what I'm trying to say. And that's the reason I think we're still seeing some of the behaviours from the past.
So you're saying regulators really need to wake up to behavioural science?
I think regulators need to embrace behavioural science and need to expect and hold their regulated firms to account to develop the capabilities. That's not to say that there isn't some wonderful work being done in the financial services sector using behavioural science, but it's the minority of firms. It's not the norm.
So do you think the regulators have a much greater role that they could play than they're currently playing?
I think the regulators can become very powerful advocates. Regulators have got power. And financial services companies can be quite short-term in their orientation. So therefore, the regulatory power combined with the advocacy for behavioural science, I think can go a long way to saving lives, saving mis-selling, saving us from the next banking blowout, and making the world a better place. Am I an optimist?
Yes, I think so. I think you are. Yeah. So let's talk about the optimistic side.
Yeah.
So you've been an auditor and in risk for sort of many years. You've gone into many organisations. Have you seen where you've come across a toxic workplace culture? You've seen these behaviours that become imbued, these bad, inappropriate behaviours imbued in the kind of day-to-day work. Have you seen a toxic workplace being transformed to a more positive workplace?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So let's talk about the ingredients that go into that transformation. Ingredient number 1 normally is quite senior management change. So that tone at the top needs to change. But within a very short period of time, you don't only have the person at the top saying something different, you've got people below him or her saying something different, and you've got a campaign going on. And that campaign is essentially, number 1, owning up to the problems of the past. Number 2, creating conversations on why these problems may have occurred. And number 3, putting mechanisms in place to allow people to talk about their dilemmas with incentivization and disincentivization structures. That takes money and it takes time, but I've seen organizations transform to a place where attrition is reduced, the bottom line goes up, and the place just feels different. It feels like a place that people want to come to work. And if you ask them why they're there, what they're doing, believe it or not, they make an association with how the sale of a financial product is making the world a better place. They're not just saying it, they believe it. So I have witnessed that transformation.
Okay, that's great. That's some really sort of good examples. Toxic workplace cultures, we haven't defined it, but in the book I define it much about causing harm over a period of time, harm to individuals, harm in terms of the organisation and its reputation. But toxic leaders, toxic individuals come into organisations, sometimes get parachuted in at very senior levels. Have you seen that? Have you kind of experienced that?
Occasionally, but more often than not. So, have I seen a toxic psychopath? Yes. Have I worked in an organisation that recruits them, breeds them, nurtures them and encourages them? No. What I have seen, however, is an organisation that has allowed its climate to become toxic. So what do I mean by that? The climate becomes very short-term in its focus. So searching for shorter-term returns and putting everything second. People compromising their values without knowing they're compromising their values. I'll give you quite an interesting example. I'm a great fan of insights discovery, which is
I know that.
Carl Jung's wonderful. I won't use the word Lego bricks. Sorry, did I use Lego bricks? But those wonderful colours.
Yes, the wonderful colours. The blue, red, greens, yellows.
I worked with a chief operating officer who led with earth green energy, and fiery red energy was last of all. So for those of you not familiar with that, what does that mean? This is an individual whose natural character is to put the human being first and to put delivery of stuff last. In other words, prioritize the well-being of people around him. That's his character. But if you look at his behaviour, it's fiery red behaviour first, earth green last. And in a moment of clarity, this guy would admit that to get his job done, which was all about delivering to short-term targets, he had to prioritise delivery to the detriment of the human being. Did it make this individual healthy? No, he was very unhealthy. Mentally, very unhealthy. Physically, very unhealthy. Did he have anyone he could talk to about his dilemmas? No, because his boss was also living in that climate. His colleagues were living in that climate, and they were quite well rewarded financially. So therefore, there was no financial incentive to say, time out, can we talk about what we're doing here? So short-term cultures frequently transform themselves into toxic cultures where people start to betray their character and their value systems.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's very much, looking at the book and looking at what the drivers were, it's all about pressures for performance.
Yeah.
Saw that in sort of Boeing, at NASA, many other organisations, that pressure for short-termism. I was just kind of reflecting back on the banks, though. I mean, I read so many sort of annual reports, and it's all about whistleblowing, isn't it? It's all really about speak up. It's all very individual focused. What do you think about that? Because what you've described is something that's going to be far more sustained change through an organisation with a lot of time and a lot of investment and a lot of people having that safe psychological safety in which to kind of reflect that back. The kind of speak up whistleblowing piece, useful or not?
Necessary. Mm-hmm. Whistleblowing does reveal problems, but normally it reveals problems after it's too late. It reveals a toxic workplace culture that's caused damage. I've never met a content whistleblower. I've met traumatized whistleblowers. I've actually met a few very rich whistleblowers. In the United States, you get quite a nice return, but by that time you probably imperiled your life and destroyed your personal life. What I think is more interesting is to try and create an environment where people can voice concerns and talk about the grey zone and talk about dilemmas before they feel the need to imperil themselves and blow the whistle. I think prevention or early detection is far better to waiting for a whistleblower to blow the whistle.
Okay. Thank you, Sandro. And I'm going to come to kind of my final question.
Yes.
And that is, if you were having the words with your younger self, when you said you joined the organisation at 17 or 18, what advice would you give your younger self now?
What a great question. Don't worry too much about the future. Take each day as it comes. Look at yourself in the mirror and be courageous. If I look back, I was too worried about upsetting people. I was too worried about the impact it would have on my career, and as a result I made compromises that I now regret. But it's very easy for me to give young Sandro that advice. Young Sandro wasn't surrounded by support mechanisms, and so as a result young Sandro made the mistakes he made and learnt from them, but they were painful mistakes.
Thank you, Sandro, for sharing that, actually, and thank you for your time.
My absolute
today.
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Susan.
you.
Cheers.
Bye.